Okay, the title of this message is Quality Control. Quality Control. I'm going to tell a little bit of a story out of the history of Israel. Jezebel's daughter, Athaliah, was queen mother, which was a high position, and her son died in battle. So she's probably, hey, I may lose the position of queen mother. Which one of David's they were younger guys, very young, was going to take over the throne? She said, none of them. And she didn't grieve for her son. She went from grieving to murder. This is Jezebel's daughter, Athaliah. She arranged to have all the sons of David assassinated, and that she would take over rulership as queen of Israel. Well, in this case, it was Judah, but she got the political power for a few years. Fortunately, a nurse saved one of the little babies, and the high priest found out about it. It was a good high priest, and he hid the child in one place where nobody could get to him, which was the temple, because only the priest could go into some of those parts of the temple. So he was raised there for 7 years. And then the priest set up a coup where he said to the army commanders, here is a son of David, here is your king. And Athaliah was dethroned, and they ended Baal worship, which, they kicked out Batan, the guy that had the big Baal temple there, destroyed it. And Israel was on a good, positive revival for a number of years. And Joash, and there's two spellings of his name, but Jehoash or Joash, actually did a good thing when he was around 20. He cleaned out the temple, totally repaired it from the damage that the pagans had done to it, and Israel was doing well, and they were blessed. I'm going to read 2 Chronicles 24:1. Joash was 7 years old when he became king. Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. That's the high priest that rescued him, Jehoiada. Then an unfortunate event happened. Some years later, the high priest died, 130. So he didn't die prematurely, but he still died. All of a sudden, the young king, because the high priest kind of ran the government with the king kind of in tandem, but the high priest was the guy that really ran it. So much so that he was buried with the kings in the special vault for all the kings of David's line. He was kind of like a king in that sense. But here's what happened. This is the part of the story that gets interesting. Younger leaders said to Joash, they said, look, we want to allow people to worship on all the hilltops. They have little groves up there. Now, their goal was they wanted to bring back paganism and be like all the other nations around them. Pretty much all the nations in the world had those kind of things. And what they did was they flattered the king and they bribed him. Well, they gave him gifts, but it's a bribe. Carl and I were talking about politicians in Washington. I was saying, once the political system bribes you, both political campaign money, gives jobs to your relatives, high paying, there are all kinds of ways they can do it. We learned this in business class, once they bribe you, if a vendor bribes you, you can never be truly objective in dealing with that vendor again. Money talks. People say, oh, no, I can take a $400,000 bribe and it wouldn't affect me. No, you can't. Now, sometimes they bribe people with sexual favors, and that's another issue, but it's still the same principle. Once you get involved in that kind of thing, sometimes they give them both, you're compromised. And they gained favor with the king. They said, you're going to be more popular if you allow people to worship at all the hilltop groves. By the way, the pagans always put their sacred poles and sacred trees. I don't know what's sacred about a tree, but you'll see that in ancient paganism on these hilltops. And if you ever go to the port of Buenos Aires, and they have this gigantic statue, and it looks like this on the top of a hill, just totally commanding the entire harbor. Anyway, I think it represents that same tradition, maybe a more universal church version of it, but the same kind of thing. The king had rejected those requested before when the high priest was with him. But now that he's alone, he gives in. And the young princes who wanted idolatry knew that once you open it up, almost every town and valley had a little hilltop grove where they had, I know we laugh at sacred trees, but that's what sacred trees and what we might call maypoles today, but they were Asherah poles. They represented kind of sex, religion, and Astarte, and a bunch of those kind of things were there. And maybe at first they said, well, we will kind of use some pagan utensils, but we're worshiping the true God of Israel. The bad guys knew that eventually many of those places could be persuaded to get more and more idolatrous and pagan, which they did. It was very doable. They were deceived and paganized, and they realized that if they had to make all their religious offerings in Jerusalem, you had well-trained priests at the temple, because books weren't available. Actually, there were no books. There were scrolls, expensive, hard to get. The priests at the temple, at least, were supposedly trained in the words of God, and they knew all the rules. But when you get out in the countryside, all kinds of things are possible. And sure enough, their plot worked. After a number of years, most of the nation had transitioned into paganism. And God had sent some warning prophets. And one day, the new high priest, who is Jehoiada's son, Zechariah, he gave a stern warning at the temple. And actually, by implications, that the leaders, including the young princes and the king, were allowing this paganism. I'll read 2 Chronicles 24:20, but it's in other parts of the Bible too. Then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, that's the high priest that saved the boy, who stood above the people, and he's kind of like on a platform, and they're all out there in the courtyard of the temple. Thus says the Lord God, why do you transgress the commandments of God? Because they end up having little wooden pagan idols, anyway, very sundry things, so that you cannot prosper because you have forsaken Jehovah. He also has forsaken you. God is a very jealous God. He does not allow pagan worship. Well, the king resented being criticized in public like that. And what he did was very evil. He told his key advisors, they didn't like it either, said, look, we want to get rid of this high priest, but we don't want it to look obvious. So you get a mob together, have all kinds of different people, arrange it in advance, and then tell them, at a signal when the priest is speaking, they will start complaining, we don't like this, what you're saying, and stoning. And they did it, and a few of the stones landed on their mark, and he was injured and subsequently died. Verse 21, they conspired against him. At the command of the king, they stoned him. And now think about it. His father saved this boy's life and gave him a good start. And Israel was blessed with peace and prosperity when they were with the true God. But yet, when they went to idolatry, he couldn't take the criticism. You know, generally, when you're criticized, you should repent and go the right way. Instead, he conspired and had the high priest's son, Zechariah, killed. And you're going to ask, well, why were hilltops so dangerous for true worship, and why was it idolatry? My overall statement would be no quality control. You could have pagan lovers all throughout the nation, and all they have to go is the local hilltop, and the people who go there, they didn't have books and Bibles available, and most couldn't read. They didn't know they may knew a little thing, but they didn't know that much. It'd be easy to start inserting paganism in many of these places. But they couldn't do it at the temple because you got well-trained priests. You have quality control at the temple in Jerusalem, but not there. So pagan lovers used it. Hosea 4:13. There are a number of criticisms in the Bible about these hilltop groves. Actually, there's one in Cape Girardeau. I may tell you all about it later, but hilltop groves where they have pagan statues and Asherah poles and sacred shrubs and trees and stuff. Anyway, here's what he said. They offer sacrifices on the mountaintops, burn incense on the hills, under oaks, poplars, and terebinths. These are big trees. Therefore your daughters commit harlotry, and your brides commit adultery. There's a kind of sexual thing that went on with paganism as well. And so it was just too many places that you could there's no way you could control hundreds and hundreds of towns with all these different places. The only way you have quality of control, purity of message, is with some kind of central control. And that's why when you read the Old Testament, God said, only bring your special offerings to the temple in Jerusalem. Remember, that's one of the things that Jeroboam did when he led Israel, the northern 10, astray, was he said, Jerusalem's too far to go. By the way, the ones who argued for worship at the hilltops, their logic was, look, it's too hard for the people to go to Jerusalem. It's so much easier. You know, God would say, if you can't go, you can't go. Just only go when you can afford to go. But anyway, but God didn't allow them to make offerings to God just anywhere they wanted. Too easy to be corrupted. And Satan is good at coordinating bad things. We can see that in America, can't we? Isn't Satan good at coordinating bad stuff? It's like, wow, that all worked out so perfectly. And human nature seems to be good at rebelling against God. It's almost like human nature says, I want to do my own thing, not what God wants me to do. And I'm going to read part of Ezekiel 6:3 and 4. I'm just going to read part of it. God says, I will destroy your high places. Verse 4. Then your altar shall be desolate, your incense altar shall be broken, and I'll cast down your slain men before your idols. And then he said in Ezekiel 18:6, I will bless those if he has not eaten on the mountains. It means they would eat meat sacrificed to Baal or Ashtarte, and there are a bunch of other pagan gods too. Nor lifted up his eye to the idols of the house of Israel, nor defiled his neighbor's wife. A lot of sexual stuff went on, like some version of wife swapping, but you got to read the details. By the way, when you study ancient history, pagan religions had no legal or moral codes like the Ten Commandments. Now, I think the Roman Empire had their own code for loyalty to Rome, had some ethics in it, but as far as pagan religions, they had no ethics. They had curses and blessings, a lot of superstitious fear. Like one was, if you want to be blessed by the god of war or the god of harvest or the god of fertility, there's a bunch of them. If you want to be blessed, you got to sacrifice some of your kids, literally. And they sacrificed a bunch of kids for prosperity. Are we doing the same thing with abortion? It makes you wonder. The same principle, like, I'm too poor to have another kid. I'm just going to kill it. I've actually heard some gruesome stories, but you don't want to hear that now. And so maybe that same spirit is still there, but and you got curses on you if you didn't do certain things and give to certain pagan things, and some of that is still in a lot of places in the world today. You'd be surprised. And they also had male and female temple prostitutes. You just think about how that. You want to make an offering to the temple, then you get to sleep with, anyway. And there was some other bad stuff. And wild parties. Actually, you see that even when Israel first went in the promised land and Moses stayed too long on the mountaintop, the way it's described, there's like a wild party that went on. So you wonder, why are carnal people attracted to paganism? Because when you read the Bible, it's written from God's point of view. And it seems like paganism is like a magnet. Whenever they don't have good leadership, I call quality control, good spiritual leadership, they would always drift into paganism. It's like, and it's hard to explain, because to me, what's the big deal about it? But apparently, human nature likes picking up a little object and say, this is a representation of the God in heaven, and if I do this or that, I'll get blessed with whatever. I mean, doesn't that seem to be what human nature likes? Right? Okay, this story is called Fairy Godmother. Now listen to these dates, because the dates are important. A couple had been married for 40 years, but also celebrated their 60th anniversary at the same time. And it was a big celebration. And all of a sudden, a fairy godmother, poof, appeared and said, because you all spent 40 years of good, loyal marriage to each other, I want to give you all a wonderful blessing. Any gift you like. So I went to the wife first. She says, well, I'd like a great trip to all the romantic places all around the globe. Poof, handed her the tickets for both of them. Ocean cruise and all the right places they go to, you know, like the great Mediterranean ports and all those places. Went to the husband. It's his turn. He said, what would you like? He said, well, I don't mind this great romantic cruise, but I'd like a wife who's 30 years younger than I am. Poof! The fairy godmother says, hey, now you're 90 years old. So be careful what you wish for. Well, Joash got the paganism that apparently he was persuaded he wanted. Well, guess what happened? As soon as he went that direction solidly, all of a sudden peace and prosperity out the window. I won't go into all the details. He had 2 horrible military experiences, even a smaller army, broke into Jerusalem, sacked the place, and things just went bad for him. He was in bed kind of commiserating, how did all this bad stuff happen to me? And he was assassinated. It looked like he was not blessed for killing the son of the man that had saved his life. But most of all, letting people through bribery and flattery pull him into idolatry. Actually, I can understand it too. In a way, when he had the older high priest who was solid for God backing him up, it was kind of easy. It's almost like your kids. Some of you know what I mean. When you're around and you're giving them good, solid advice, but when they're out on their own, who knows what's going to happen? You know what I'm saying, right? Maybe it's not exactly the same, but when the high priest passed away, he was on his own. And it's like evil people were attracted to him. I heard a famous politician, when he got in office, he wanted to clean up corruption. A lot of corrupt people went toward him with flattery and trying to undermine him from the inside. And I'm thinking, that sounds like Satan. It sounds like human nature. And you have to be strong to handle that. So he was assassinated. But he had peace and prosperity when he obeyed and followed God and did everything and allowed quality control at the temple to be the norm. Well, I'm going to now apply it to us just a little bit. Here's what might be true for us. If you have a bunch of totally independent church congregations that can teach and do anything they want, anytime they want, isn't that a perfect opportunity for Satan to try to plow his wares? Think about it, right? Now, our church, and I remember when Garner Ted put it in, we were first starting a new corporation, he put in there we would cooperate with independent churches, and there are a number of them that do cooperate with us, and some of them have people that have been on the program for Pentecost. I won't go into details. So we do cooperate with independents that want to cooperate with us. But if everybody's doing his own thing out there, and I don't know, I'd go into details. I've been through a lot of experiences, could give you names and places, but you get the general idea. You realize that just like that, a false doctrine could slip in, then they got to defend what they said, and then it goes down. It's almost like you're at a certain, and there can be some variation of opinion. We're not saying everything has to be perfect, but bounce around, and suddenly they get to that slippery slope, and they go down into things that are clearly unbiblical, very, very bad for them spiritually. So you need, like, if I were to come up with some weird doctrine, I know the people of the home office say, "What are you doing? Can you defend that?" And you wouldn't be able to get it, or I'd have to qualify, back off of it. In other words, there is some quality control, And it's good to know that there's some quality control. I want to go to Ezekiel 18:15. God is through the prophet again saying to the people of Israel, "Though who have not eaten on the mountains, nor lifted his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel," because the northern 10 had already gone into captivity for their idols, "nor defiled his neighbor's wife, he will bless them." In other words, if we want to be blessed, we have to stay true to core doctrines and to the real God, the real Jesus Christ, and his real basic laws and ways. It's like quality control, like guardrails on a highway. You know, when you're getting ready to fall off the highway, off the cliff, you hit the guardrails, at least on a big mountain road, and it grinds on your car fender, and you know to get back in the center. The guardrails are our protection. Well, and here's what we have to do to keep quality control. We must stay unified around the home office. And I know unity is hard to stay. Been in the church, actually been in the ministry for 43 years. It's even hard for me to believe I'm that old. Anyway, but I think that's the right date. But if it is, it doesn't matter. It's close to that if that is, I'm calculating in my head. But boy, have I seen a lot of things happen over those years. It's hard to maintain unity. Matter of fact, I know of one local church we'll go and talk several times about a disunifying force in their church. So far, it hasn't broken up yet. We're hoping to hold it together, trying for and praying for them. I won't give you names because you know some of the people. My point is, there are always forces of disunity. It's almost like human nature. You know how human nature is, right? I want to do my own thing, and everybody wants to be Mr. Big. They wouldn't say it that bluntly, but you know what I mean. And I'm not oversimplifying it, but pray for unity in the church. And we should strive for as much unity as we can get. We don't have to be unified in every single thing, but we don't want much variety in there. Keep it pretty close. Stay close to God. And what we want to have is deep spiritual, doctrinal insight and doctrinal purity. We want to pray for deep spiritual insight and doctrinal purity. I mean, we don't have to be agreeing on every little thing, but for the most part, and most of all, pray for unity, that we can stay together. Because one of the things I think Satan loves is disunity. If I give an opinion and I'm wrong, you can tell me later. I can see him breaking up the Republican Party, the only defense against a very evil establishment. And you can see he's pushing disunity. I can see it at the debates. And Satan knows what he's doing. I've seen him do that in the church. And he's pushing disunity on Judah or Israel in the Middle East. If you see them fighting about Netanyahu, you can sense it's the same spirit as here. The similarities are so starkly similar. You know it's got to be the same spiritual strategy and playbook. So Satan loves disunity, and he knows how to play it. And human nature is vulnerable for that. And also pray for love, because sometimes love covers a multitude of sins. Well, I don't like you, or I don't like the way you say it, or you don't have the charisma that so-and-so has. But because of love, we'll stay together. That's what we should pray for. And let's face it, we aren't all that charismatic leaders. We don't have a great charismatic leader at the moment, but we can still stay unified anyway, can't we? Right? We don't have to have super charisma or whatever people, however they would word it. We can stay unified anyway. God will someday bring the two witnesses, and I guess they'll have the charismatic leadership. But in the meantime, out of Christian love and smarts, we know the devil's strategies, stay unified and love each other. And we're going to talk about Matthew 5 next week on the podcast. But you know when he said love your enemies? Well, you can also apply that inside an organization too. Maybe you have a rival or two inside the church for some, at least you think it in your head, for some office, some influence, or whatever, male or female. Even if you see them as a rival, you should love them. I'm going to somehow undermine him so I will get more attention than he. You know the kind of thing human nature does, right? If you think about it, isn't that what Christ was really saying? At one point he says, when you go to make your offering and you want to pray to God, but you have a bitterness between you and a brother could be a church member or a family member. He says, leave your altar there and go make up with your brother and then finish your offering. Because God doesn't want to hear it if you hate your brother or you got something against him and you're holding a horrible grudge. Sometimes you can't work everything out, but at least we should do our part to work it out. And at least we don't have to hate them back. They may be against us, but we don't have to be against them. Of course, all that's easy to say, and it's easy to say. It's hard to do because human nature is what it is. But go for unity, for men and women, because squabbles can be terrible, both men and women. So handle squabbles with love. Kind of love each other into unity as much as that's possible. Now, in the New Covenant, what was quality control in the New Covenant? I would argue in the New Covenant, at least for all the Gentile churches that most of the New Testament is written about, quality control was the Apostle Paul. Christ had spent extra time teaching him, and he was a Bible scholar even before that, so it would snap into place. He had the truth. He was quality control. I'm not saying he didn't get along with the other apostles, and I'm sure in their part of the world with the Jewish people, they were quality control too. But for most of the New Testament, it's Paul who was quality control. I want to go to Galatians 1, 6-9. And when you read what Paul said, you can see the principle of quality control in Paul's words. And this is a really important part of Galatians 1, 6-9. A little bit of the background. Because they're part of the Jewish community in general, they were considered an unpopular sect, the Nazarenes, within Judaism. But other Jews would come along and say, well, I believe that Christ was the Messiah. And I believe too, and they saw the momentum that believers in Jesus Christ had, and they wanted to get in on it. But they would say, yes, but we need to do what I call circumcision and what I call the over-regulation of Judaism. We've talked about that before. And many of the Gentiles, they came straightly out of paganism. They knew nothing about the Bible. And these Jewish guys had probably been studying the Bible most of their lives. They would listen to them. So with that background, it's like Paul would come establish a church in Galatians and some of his followers in other cities. We could rattle them off, but Thessalonica. Right behind him, within a year or two behind him, would come the Judaizers. Paul's not around, right? He ain't here. They actually even wrote counterfeit letters with his name on it. You'll see that mentioned in 2 Thessalonians 2. And they probably did other things tricky and deceptive as well. And Paul says that. They would come along and say, look, Paul isn't a real full apostle like the other 12, and he didn't quite get it straight. And they would start changing the message. And also, Paul fought a two-front war. He had I call the self-righteous Judaizers on one side, maybe the right side. And on the left side, people that wanted to pull them into pagan compromises. And you'll see some of his words seem to be fighting pressures on both sides. So consider that. Then I'm going to read Galatians 1:6. I marvel that you're turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel. In other words, I gave you the truth. I gave you the quality doctrine, and now you're letting people talk you into something else, which is not another. In other words, it's not really another gospel. It's really false. But there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. In other words, they have ulterior motives. But even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel, in other words, even if you get an angelic vision, because maybe the demon could do that, I don't know. He said, no matter who does it, if anybody does it, including an angel, preach any other gospel, verse 8, to you then what we preach to you, let him be accursed. So Paul is saying, I gave you quality control. Most cases he spent about 6-7 months with that church teaching them. Some places longer, some less. But in those 6 months when I preached the truth, that's the truth. Stay with that. Don't let anything pull you astray to the left or to the right. Verse 9. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel than what you received, meaning when Paul made his first visit and started that church, let him be accursed. Paul is being blunt. Paul knew the Judaizers and the pagans is a two-front war, and apparently he learned the hard way from rumors he heard about, including this church starting to change their thoughts. To undermine. By the way, they often undermine Paul. When you read Corinthians and many of the other letters, you see Paul in a defensive mode, defending his apostleship, defending his teaching, defending his motives. Because one of the things you do if you're a false prophet and you come to a group of people and say, I want to mislead them, you want them to follow you and your associates so you can control the money, whatever. You got to undermine, if you want to call it the home office, you got to undermine the true quality control presenter. And they did that. And you read Paul's epistles and you see him defending himself all the time. He's not doing that because he's defensive. Those people need to know, actually he says it in Corinth, false apostles. He actually calls them false apostles. No, he hadn't beat around the bush. He said, just like Satan appears as an angel of light, Satan likes to appear pious, but he's really devious and evil. And he wants to, and these new Gentiles would be very vulnerable to it. Paul said, if it's not what I gave you at first, reject it. Colossians 2:4. Colossians 2:4. Now this I say, lest anyone should deceive you with persuasive words. And some people are very clever. Let's face it, they are very clever. They can play games with words and they can twist stuff, and people are clever, and they may have been good speakers from the Greek perspective, good voice and Greek elocution and whatever, persuasive words. For though I am absent in the flesh, because Paul, travel was limited and they didn't have telephones, and Paul couldn't get to them except by a letter, which took a long time to get there, and we have many of those letters, and travel was such, he was tied up halfway around the world somewhere else. Anyway, 500 miles away, he couldn't get to them. So, though I am absent in the flesh, yet I am with you in spirit, rejoicing to see your good order and steadfastness in the faith of Christ. He's emphasizing steadfastness. As you have therefore received Christ the Lord, so walk in him. In other words, stay with what I gave you. And as we get closer to the end, remember Christ said the first sign about the return of Christ is great deception. The first horse in the forest from the apocalypse is the white horse, religious deception. So as we get closer to the end, we're going to see more deception. 1 Timothy 4:1 and 2. 1 Timothy 4:1 and 2. Now the Spirit expressly says that in the latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. And who's behind much of this deception? It might have been true in the days of Joash, too. It was demons. Speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with hot iron. These people don't have any conscience. They'll lie and do anything. 1 Timothy 4:7. But reject profane and old-wise fables. Exercise yourself toward godliness. In other words, try to work on godliness and reject any new doctrines. And Paul in 2 Timothy 4 was near martyrdom. When you read the context, he says, I'm soon going to be poured out. He's near martyrdom. So quality control now goes to Paul's protege. And who was Paul's protege? Timothy, at least to most of those Gentile churches probably for another 20 years or so. It was Timothy. Timothy now represents quality control. 2 Timothy 4:2. 2 Timothy 4:2. Preach the word. Be ready in season, out of season. It's almost like Paul and Timothy created a host of churches that Paul was responsible for, even though he traveled all over and couldn't get to them as frequently as he'd like. he was like, and Timothy as well, it was like a traveling home office to all those churches. And whenever they had problems, they'd write to Paul, and Paul would get letters from, let's say, the lady in Corinth. Horrible things are happening in Corinth, Paul. You wouldn't believe the chaos here. And then, we know he wrote him a letter, and he eventually got there and straightened things out. The point is, Paul and Timothy were like an evangelistic team. There was like a home office to all those many churches that Paul created throughout the Roman Empire. And here's what he tells Timothy. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. That means holy day season, non-holy day season. Convince, rebuke, exhort. Rebuke means you can tell people, hey, you need to do better. This isn't right what you're doing. In other words, but generally, pagans and worldly people, they just want to hear smooth things. There are a lot of churches that only teach positive stuff. There are churches that they call churches of positive thinking and prosperity gospel. Nothing but positive stuff. Well, positive stuff is okay, but the gospel is not just positive stuff. Rebuke, exhort, with long suffering and teaching. Verse 3, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine. Now that happened in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, but it may get worse in our day and age. I'm told there are churches now where, especially mega churches, if they want to stay popular, they can't discuss anything like abortion or drag queen story hour. Some even are allowing it in their church for popularity purposes. And they don't want to say anything to reinforce traditional marriage, because that's controversial. I'm not making any of this stuff up. And those pastors are told, we don't want any trouble. You just avoid those subjects, which is almost a way of saying it's okay. You see what I mean? Don't say they want things that their ear likes to hear. It's okay to do whatever I want to do. And isn't that popular? It sounds like what the pagans told the people in Israel. Do whatever you want to do. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up to themselves teachers. And as we approach the end of this age, I just have a few final comments. Deception will get worse. So I want to just briefly discuss the guardrails that we have, and we should try our best to strengthen our guardrails against drifting either too far into self-righteous stuff, which probably in this world is not likely, but it could, or into compromise with paganism stuff to the left, or leaving altogether. Some churches are pretty much left biblical standards. I remember they had that battle in St. Louis 3 years ago with, I think, at United Methodist. Churches from overseas where they suffer a lot more, they wanted to stick to Bible standards. Churches, especially ones in California, those standards are old-fashioned. We don't want to have biblical standards. They literally said, we don't want biblical standards in our church. We want modern-day standards of conduct. And I'm not making, because when you read it in the paper, you think, well, modern-day standards change, and they get worse and worse and worse. But they're big churches, and those organizations are splitting because of that, and we'll have to see how that works out. But here are the guardrails. Number one, know the basics and why you believe it. Now, there's no certain verses like Romans 3:31 and Romans 6:1 and 2, and a bunch of other verses that, know those verses well. Know what you believe and why you believe it. Where Paul said, hey, grace does not mean you don't need the law. Actually, grace supports the law. Paul says, are you kidding me? There's no way that faith undermines grace. Never. That's what he said. You know those verses and why you believe it. Number two, watch line upon line. I think this was discussed when we were off camera, so you probably didn't hear it. But Stan said, line upon line, he's learned, now he's been doing it for about a year, strengthens Christians, because we go through little sections of the Bible and we, unpack it, clarify it, and you're learning more stuff little by little every week. And I think it's good if you can afford Wi-Fi or whatever you can do, try to get line upon line, watch it every week. It'll make us stronger. strengthen our guardrails. Number 3, pray for wisdom, for leadership, and wisdom for each of us regarding spiritual matters, because the world is tricky. Human nature is tricky. Number 4, my final suggestion. All of us need to get closer and closer to God and stronger so we can have unity. And love. Let's get stronger and stronger. Okay, we're going to skip the next song, if that's all right with you all, and stand up, and I want to give a closing prayer. A prayer to bless the food for one of our fabulous potlucks. And I guess you can cut the tape off.